Now for this first example, for this delete button, let's remove this hello text. And instead, inside of this div, I'll add another div. I'll add another div, and before that div, a h1 tag where I say my to-dos, because that was also some text which we had there. And then this other div next to the h1 tag, inside of the outer div, that div will contain that single to-do, item which we have in this dummy project. For that, I'll use a h2 tag for the title. And then below that, I want to have that delete button here. Now, I'm using regular HTML elements here, because when working with JSX, you can use your own elements, your own components if you have some, but you can also use all the built-in default browser tags, like divs, paragraphs, h1 tags, buttons, inputs, and so on. So in the end here, in the component, we just write the HTML code that should eventually appear on the screen. So the output that should be rendered by the browser. So for this, we have our to-do item here and some title above it. And on that button, I'll now say delete. That was the text we had here. Now for styling purposes, we're going to add some styling soon. I'll add another div here and actually put that button inside of that div. And now I pressed this format document shortcut to auto-format this code and make it a bit more readable. Now that's a more complex HTML structure, and if we now save this file and we reload, or actually we don't even need to reload because of this auto-reloading built into the dev server, we should see that output here. The title, the delete button, and my to-dos. Now the delete button is not doing anything at the moment, and the title also is just static text, but we again see that we can influence what shows up in the browser with the code we define in our app component here. Now, some styling would be nice. And for this, I attached the index CSS file, which you also find attached here, which contains some basic styling for this first demo. You can simply replace your index CSS file with the attached one. And if you do that and reload, it looks a bit nicer. And we can also now add some CSS classes here to this code. Some CSS classes that will also influence the styling. For example, to this div, which contains the title and the nested div, I want to add a class of card. Now in regular HTML, you would do that by adding the class attribute and setting this to card, for example. Now this is not how you should do it with React. This code here looks like HTML, but it actually isn't. Behind the scenes, it is transformed to standard JavaScript. And in standard JavaScript, for one, class is a keyword, but even more important than that, if you look at vanilla JavaScript, the property name of a HTML element object for assigning or for setting the CSS classes on that object is actually class name, not class. That's just how vanilla JavaScript works. And therefore here, the attribute name actually also is class name. Now again, this can be confusing because it looks like HTML, and in standard HTML that would be class. But since this isn't HTML, since this in the end is JavaScript, just looking differently, we need to keep minor things like this in mind. Now, the good news is, however, that this is one of the very rare cases where the attribute name differs from the property name, and we have to use the property name here, and hence we don't use what we would write in standard HTML. In most cases, you can write standard HTML code here, and the class name is the most prominent special case in React, where you assign a CSS class to an element with class name as a attribute, in quotes, added to an element. But with that, if we save this again, now we have this card look of this to-do. Now there are a couple of other classes that should be added. For example, on this div, which holds the button, you should add a class name of actions. And on the button here, we add a class name of btn for button. We do all of that. That's the look we get, and that looks a bit nicer. So now we also added some styling to our first component simply by changing the code in the index CSS file and adding a couple of classes here, and therefore our first component is taking shape. However, at the moment, all that code is in one component, and there are a couple of reasons why we might want to split that up and also make our component a bit more flexible.